Okay, well, good morning everyone. Lovely to see you all this morning. I'm so impressed with how on time everybody is. This is awesome. Good effort. Today's lecture, as you know, is going to be about politics in Shakespeare's London. And I'm going to be focusing particularly on the play Richard II. And I want to pick up really where we left off last week, in which we sought to develop a better understanding of Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus by visiting two distinct neighbourhoods in Shakespeare's city. You'll remember we thought about St Paul's as the centre of the printing trade, and we also thought about Tyburn as the centre of violence, I suppose, the site of public executions in Shakespeare's city. On the 25th of February of 1601, this is an important date, a really significant execution took place in early modern London. In the courtyard of the Tower, which we're familiar with from the map that we looked at in class last week, there was a beheading which took place in front of a small crowd. As we also learned last week, beheadings were quite unusual and executions at the Tower were quite unusual, and both of these facts stem from the fact that it was an unusual person who was being executed. This was a man of extremely high status. So just to show you again the map we looked at last week, this is the lawn where the execution would have taken place, and this is the man who was executed, the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux. You can see him looking very splendid, almost regal in his outfit. He was really, for a long time, Queen Elizabeth's favourite, and you can see him kind of playing up to that image in this picture. He's quite elaborately dressed. I hope you can all make out the slides clearly. Is that, you can see them at the back? Good. So, Essex was beheaded at the Tower. As I've said, the way his life ended reflected his status, but it also reflected the nature of his crime. Essex was being killed because he'd committed treason, or so it was thought. Within a week of Essex's death, the printing presses of St Paul's that we thought about last week were pressed into action. Quite a quick turnaround, of issuing several popular accounts of his downfall, lots of kind of bawdy poems about what had happened to him, and also printing lots of sermons that had been preached upon the occasion of his death. And just to show you one of those, this is a sermon preached at Paul's Cross. So this is exactly the neighbourhood of London we were in last time. It's been preached at St Paul's Cross. It's been printed in Paul's churchyard. And it's telling of the downfall of Essex and basically holding him up as an example to good Christians of what you shouldn't do. So this is the death of the Earl of Essex. And as you'll be hearing in today's lecture, this is an important aspect of the way that Richard II has been interpreted and has been understood. And the first section of the lecture, just in a moment, will be focusing on critical interpretations of Richard II and the way that people have tried to read the play politically in the context of what happened to the Earl of Essex. You'll have read about this in the course pack essay reading for this week, but I'll be explaining it in a lot more detail. The play itself is intimately connected with politics, both those of its medieval setting, the 14th century court of the historical King Richard II himself, and also the politics of Elizabethan England, in which the play was first written and performed. Written, I should say, we think in 1595, published 2 years later. Perhaps, as I've said, more than any other play, it's been subject to political interpretations. And I'm going to be spending a bit of time explaining why this has been now. I should also say that the location we'll focus on this week is going to be the political heart of Shakespeare's London. We're going to be thinking about Whitehall, which is still the political heart of our city today. And we'll spend a little bit of time in the second bit of the lecture kind of exploring that neighbourhood and its relationship to the play as well. So, why begin then with the execution of the Earl of Essex? Why is his story so caught up in that of Shakespeare's Richard II? Well, I'm going to try and set out the answers to some of these questions and to explain why so many critics have thought about the play in such political terms. Essex brought about his own downfall in many ways by doing several We could say politically naive, that might be being a bit kind. Downright stupid, I think, might be closer to the truth. Several rather stupid things to annoy Elizabeth I. As you know, a very bad thing to do at the turn of the 17th century. So firstly, he'd been given the task of leading a military expedition to Ireland, and he got there. He'd said to the Queen, I'll win this one, no problem, this is going to be easy. Got to Ireland, found that it was a lot harder than he'd expected to subdue the population there, not surprisingly. They didn't want to have their lands taken. So got to Ireland, realised very swiftly this was going to be a disaster, abandoned his own troops in order to come back to London, realising the task was impossible, and then made matters even worse by storming into the Queen's bedchamber one morning before she was properly dressed in order to justify what he'd done. So poor Essex kind of went from being the Queen's favourite to committing these kind of disastrous acts. Elizabeth was also annoyed by the fact that Essex was extremely popular, especially amongst Londoners. People in this city just loved him. We saw what a kind of glamorous figure he was. He was kind of a London celebrity, I suppose, of the day. And I think Elizabeth was a bit jealous, as were several members of her court. Some of the really politically important figures of Elizabeth's court were basically plotting against Essex. They hated the fact that he'd been given certain opportunities. They hated the fact that he'd been the Queen's favourite. And so they were trying to bring about his downfall as well. So lots of popular figures at the court were really against Essex, which is not a good position to be in. He has quite a precarious position indeed at court, and there were repeated attempts to try and construct a treason case against him throughout the year 1600. So in 1601, the year that he would eventually be executed, things really got a lot worse. Essex knew that people at the court were plotting against him. And in early February, he had the idea, again, not his smartest idea, I don't think, that what he really needed to do was to go to the Queen and explain to her what his position was, justify what he'd been doing and ask her forgiveness. But not very cleverly, he thought that the best way to do this was to gather a troop of about 100 noblemen from London, people who supported him, and take them along to the palace with him. So you can imagine how this looks like from the Queen's point of view. Somebody about whom you've heard rumours that they're plotting treason against you is going to march on your palace with 100 men. She was understandably quite alarmed, and as a result arranged to have Essex arrested and eventually executed. So this really was an absolute disaster. Essex was besieged in his own house, which was on the Strand, actually very close to where we are today. Essex House was about 2 blocks that way, and it was one of those enormous houses on the Strand that we talked about in the very first week. Very fashionable. It had 42 bedrooms, if you can believe that. So an absolute mansion, and a garden going down to the river, so extremely luxurious. So that's where Essex was captured and arrested, forced to surrender. So history's called this episode the Essex Uprising, and popular accounts of these events suggest that what Essex was hoping to do was to seize the throne of England for himself, to usurp Elizabeth I, in other words. And you can start to see how the story of the Essex Uprising has some similarities with the story of Richard II, which is about somebody seizing power. As you'll have read, though, in the article this week by Paul Hammer, there's in fact very little actual evidence that Essex wanted the throne for himself, and a lot of evidence to suggest why his enemies would kind of want to spread this rumour, why they'd want to accuse him of having ambitions to the crown. We don't actually know that this is what he wanted to do, so we need to be a little bit sceptical about this version of events. We might think a little bit about the parallels between the moral ambiguities of this and the moral ambiguities of Richard II. Bear in mind, Shakespeare doesn't present us with a Bolingbroke who clearly sets out from day one to steal the crown. it's a little bit unclear. Bolingbroke is much more equivocal than you might be expecting. So think about some of these moral ambiguities, as I say, as having something in common with the Essex story. There's another more explicit connection between the Essex story and Richard's downfall, which I'll just explain now. And that's the fact that on the evening before what supposedly was the planned rebellion, so the 7th of February of 1601, a group of Essex's supporters finished their lunch in a tavern near Middle Temple. So again, that's about a block that way. They finished their lunch, they got in one of those little boats, the little skiffs, crossed the river, went to the Globe to watch a play. And this is a special play because it's a play that Essex's supporters had particularly asked to be staged at the Globe that day. They'd paid the Chamberlain's Men, that's Shakespeare's acting company, quite a large sum of money in order to stage this particular play. And according to popular accounts, this play was, of course, Richard II, Shakespeare's Richard II. So, we need to ask, why would the so-called Essex conspirators want to watch this particular play on the eve of the planned uprising, if it was a planned uprising? Critics have often suggested that they were trying to incite popular support for their rebellion, that they were showing this play about deposing a king in order to get the people of London behind Essex in his supposed attempt to depose Elizabeth I. This version of events has been helped by the fact that Queen Elizabeth herself, in a conversation with a historian called William Lambard, seemed to strengthen the case for it. She supposedly said to Lambard, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" So she seemed to be suggesting here that she interpreted the play of Richard II's downfall as being in some way a mirror of her own life, and that therefore the Essex conspirators wanted to watch it because it would kind of prefigure what they were about to do to bring down Elizabeth I herself. Incidentally, the RSC's history cycle, which happened in 2007 to 8, really played on this idea of an identification between Richard and Elizabeth. You can see Jonathan Slinger, the actor who played Richard, has had the costume, makeup and wig basically to make him look like Elizabeth I. There was an amazing moment at the start of the play where they opened the doors at the back of the theatre and they had him enter down the central aisle, just kind of in a spotlight, and you just thought it's Elizabeth I. They're really playing on this iconography and this identification. Okay, so all of this makes for quite a compelling story. And it's been convenient to a whole generation of critics interested in reading political meaning into Shakespeare's plays to kind of emphasise the connections or possible connections between the Essex Uprising, the staging of Richard II, and what Shakespeare actually writes in the play. I'm going to read quite a long passage explaining this from an article by Blair Worden in the London Review of Books. He says, "The episode is a godsend for critics eager to involve Shakespeare's writing in the politics of its time. Contemporary critics Stephen Greenblatt and Jonathan Dollimore at their head draw bold inferences from it. In widely influential works, they describe the performance at the Globe as, quote, a famous attempt to use the theatre to subvert authority, as a move to wrest legitimation from the established ruler, as an effort to encourage or incite rebellion against Elizabeth, thereby associating Shakespeare with their treason, and as evidence that, quote, subordinate, marginal or dissident elements could appropriate dominant discourses and transform them." So Worden basically dislikes this way of reading the play politically. He says, in my view, both their claims and their premises are equally questionable. Instead of establishing true connections between literature and politics, the determination to politicise Shakespeare has, in this case, obscured them. The episode of 7th of February 1601, so this is the performance of Richard II, demonstrates the existence of such connections, but in ways that have nothing to do with him, nothing to do with Shakespeare. So the particular critics that Blair Worden mentions here, Stephen Greenblatt and Jonathan Dollimore, are the leading figures in a movement to establish a kind of political Shakespeare. And this movement, or this kind of literary criticism, is what's known as New Historicism. I don't know if this is a term that you've come across before, but New Historicism has been a very influential move in the interpretation of Shakespeare. And what it really seeks to do is establish relationships between literature and the time and the place in which that literature was written. So it's interested in the context of Shakespeare's plays, and particularly often the political context. So New Historicism is very much about power relationships, I suppose, and whether texts are written in ways that enforce the dominant ideologies of their time or question those ideologies. And that's the kind of issue that New Historicism is concerned with. But New Historicism was also, as Blair Worden is suggesting here, being quite heavily criticised. The critic Schoenbaum, in his essay on Shakespeare II and Realities of Power, which is in your reading list, dismisses New Historicism as occasionalism. He sees it as just focusing on coincidental resemblances that may not always be based in fact. In the article by Paul Hammer that you read, you'll have seen him thoroughly questioning many of the assumptions of the Essex story that I've laid out this morning. And he basically points out that we have neither evidence that the Richard II performed that day was actually Shakespeare's play, and nor do we have evidence in any case that Essex was trying to lead an uprising. So whilst it's been convenient for critics to interpret things in this way, that's not necessarily what happened. And it's important to note the way that the history of interpreting the play has been bound up in this agenda of New Historicism that I've described. On this course, of course, we're also interested in connections between plays and the context in which they're written, the time and the place in which they're written, namely Shakespeare's London. But we've got to be really careful not to oversimplify those connections, and that's really what this first section of the lecture has been about, really. In the rest of the lecture, I'm going to be interested in reading the politics of Richard II and their connections to London life. But I'm going to be doing this not by focusing too much on the 1601 Essex episode, which so many critics have spent their time and energy on, but rather on thinking about the contents of the play itself, its own political world, which is entirely complete and really important, I think. And also is a political world that has its own geography and its own values. So as such, I'm going to try and avoid what Worden calls the politicisation of Shakespeare, and we're going to think instead about Shakespeare's politics in ways that do have something to do with him, I suppose. As I've said, we're going to focus on the location of Whitehall, and the next section of the lecture is going to set out for you politics in Shakespeare's London, I suppose, at the time he was writing. Richard II is unusual in that it has quite a few London locations. Whilst the actions of the play range from castles in Wales to Scotland to Bristol, it also contains scenes set in Ely House, for example. Ely House, confusingly, is not in Ely, but it's just near Holborn, near modern-day Hatton Gardens. And in the play, Ely House, this is a 16th century image of what it looked like, massive complex, really, of buildings. Ely House was connected with John of Gaunt's family. And it's the scene for the famous speech that he gives just before he dies. This is the famous "This Earth, this Realm, this England" speech. He describes the country as this royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to house against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. I'm sorry, it's hard to get the necessary stirring tone to read this speech. It's normally recited with Elgar in the background as a kind of definition of what it means to be English. If you've read the play, you'll know that it's actually excerpted from a longer speech that's very critical of the current state of England. So it's kind of ironic that this is cited again and again as the ultimate patriotic statement. But notice, he's sitting in Ely House in London, and he's comparing England to being the country itself is like a house with protective walls and a moat around it. So the London location is important. One of the other important London locations in Richard II occurs towards the end when we get the farewell scene between Isabel and Richard. And this is kind of a snatched moment in the streets of London. She's forced to wait in the street in the hope of catching her husband, who's been arrested and is wholly in Bolingbroke's power by this point. This is an image also from the history cycle of this kind of goodbye scene. Notice how Slinger, from having the full-on wig and the ornate cape behind him, has now been kind of stripped of all the trimmings of being the king. He doesn't look like Elizabeth I anymore. So this is the RSC's version of that farewell scene. But it takes place in a street near the Tower of London, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important as the lecture continues. We even get a mention in the play of the kind of seedier side of London, when the newly crowned Henry IV wonders where his son might be. This is at the start of Act 5, Scene 3. He says, "Can no man tell of my unthrifty son? 'Tis full 3 months since I did see him last. If any plague hang over us, 'tis he. I would to God, my lords, he might be found. Inquire at London, 'mongst the taverns there. For there, they say, he daily doth frequent with unrestrained loose companions." So it's a wonderful phrase, unrestrained loose companions. So the son being referred to here is Prince Hal. And for any of you who've seen the Henry IV plays or Henry V, the next plays in Shakespeare's history cycle, I can see you're despairing at what happens to Prince Hal. The next plays in the history cycle are about the challenge to redeem Hal, who has this kind of dissolute life in the taverns of London, and make him into a proper king, a suitable candidate to be king. This is Hal and his great drinking buddy Falstaff, also from the history cycle by the RSC. Okay, so I've set out a few of the different London locations that are important in the play, but the most important one of all is, of course, the Parliament itself, held in Westminster Hall in Whitehall. And this is an image of what Westminster Hall would have been like then. You can still go, it looks just the same today, so by all means go down there and have a little look at what it's like. Because this is a key location for the play and for our course, I'm going to describe for a few moments what Whitehall and Westminster was like in Shakespeare's day, and indeed what it was like during Richard's rule. Richard, incidentally, was on the throne from 1377 to 99, so bear that medieval date in mind, as well as the early modern dates of Shakespeare's lifetime, 1377 to 99. Okay, so Westminster Hall was part of the Old Palace of Westminster, and you can see just how grand this complex was from this image here, fronting onto the river as Westminster does now. We've not got, note, the Gothic Big Ben, okay, that was a much later addition, but some of these buildings are still there. The Palace of Westminster was that was used by the historical King Richard II himself, okay, and by his successor, Henry IV. And it was part of a complex, as I've said, of kind of governmental buildings, law courts, palaces, all at Whitehall. I have a map which is from a period slightly later than Shakespeare's lifetime, but it gives us some idea of what it was like. And on this map, you can actually just about make out that there are tennis courts marked and a tilting yard for jousting. So you get some sense of all of the things that went on at Westminster. It wasn't just the political debates that we have here. As usual, all of these slides are on Blackboard, so spend a bit of time looking at them and puzzling them out, because it's a really fascinating map. Okay, so that gives you some sense of what the Whitehall complex of palaces was like. This is, on the left, an image of the actual Whitehall Palace, and I've just put up the contrast with the modern Buckingham Palace, which the monarchs live in now. The Buckingham Palace was only built much later on. The monarchs started to move into Buckingham Palace in the early 18th century. The London home of the King or Queen of England before that period was Whitehall Palace, which is why we're focusing on it today. It's worth saying as well that the only surviving bit of Whitehall Palace today is the Banqueting Hall. If you walk down Whitehall, you'll see, if you're going towards Westminster, this Banqueting Hall is still there on the left-hand side. Although this particular bit of it comes from just at the end, well, just after Shakespeare's death. But there is still a bit you can go and look at. You've got the interior view there, as well as the exterior. And this bit was built by James I. You can also hire the Banqueting Hall for parties. And there was a long tradition of having parties in what's known as the Undercroft. I'm sorry it's such a small image, but the basements of the Banqueting Hall have seen lots of debauchery over the years, and Ben Jonson wrote a little poem about all the kind of drinking and carousing that went on there, which I won't read out now, but it's quite fun. Okay, less cheerily though, the Whitehall Banqueting Hall was also the scene of the execution of Charles I. This is the only moment in England's history at which we've had a Republican government. Oliver Cromwell had Charles I executed 30th of January 1649. And he actually, as you can just about make out, he stepped out of a first floor window onto a raised platform. And this is so, like the public executions we talked about last week, this is so people could see what was happening. As many people as possible could see what happened to him. So that's a little bit about the history of Whitehall and Westminster. I've put up here a quote from a really useful article, which is also on your reading list, by Anne Barton, The London Scene, City and Court. And she describes here the kind of multi-purpose function, I suppose, of Whitehall Palace. She says it housed the sovereign's person in a series of carefully graded spaces extending outward from the intimacy of the bedchamber and various withdrawing chambers, access to which was denied to all but a select few, to the somewhat more populous but still elite Privy Chamber, the Presence Chamber, where the monarch could sometimes be viewed by those with any right to be present at court at all, receiving ambassadors and other guests, or dining in state, the Great Chamber, and finally a hall. So what you've got basically, this is a bit like a kind of, it's like a series of Russian dolls nesting one inside each other. There were a series of rooms in the palace that were increasingly private, and depending on how far you got through was a reflection of your personal status. So if you were quite lowly, you might only be allowed into the Great Hall and catch a glimpse of the monarch at a great distance. But if you were very important, if you were a visiting ambassador, for example, you might be allowed into one of the inner chambers for a kind of closer audience with the monarch. The Great Hall, which Barton mentions here, is the hall in which we witness the culmination of the events of Richard II, when he's formally called upon to give up the crown in favour of Bolingbroke, who's about to become Henry IV. And this is known as the Deposition Scene. And you have here a wonderful medieval image of how they imagined the deposition of Richard II would look, and then a contrasting image from the 2005 Old Vic production. That's Kevin Spacey as Richard, kind of offering up the crown to Ben Miles, who's playing Bolingbroke, and you can see on the look on their faces there, there's a kind of challenging look on Spacey's face, and Miles is looking a bit uncertain about whether he should be taking it, I suppose. Some productions, coincidentally, stage this scene as a kind of tug of war. The RSC's history that I was talking about before, their history cycle, had him hand the crown over, but then he wouldn't let go of it. So Bolingbroke had hold of one side and Richard the other, and they were literally having a tug of war with the crown. So the key thing to bear in mind about the deposition scene is the way in which Shakespeare portrays Bolingbroke as wanting to be sure that everything is done properly. When you read it, or if you've read it already, you'll have noticed that Richard's position by the time we get to this scene is already hopeless. Bolingbroke could, if he wanted, just force Richard to give him the crown. He could just seize the crown. Most of the nobility of the country supports Bolingbroke's claim by this point and not Richard's. But it matters to Bolingbroke that Richard must be made to come to Westminster Hall and to hand the crown over to him in person in this particular place. And I want to think for a moment about why this place is so important. One of the reasons, I think, is that historically it was Richard II who commissioned the building of Westminster Hall, and he arranged for it to be built at great expense as a kind of symbol of his own royal power. And the Westminster Hall that's still there is the one that Richard II started to have built in the 14th century. So it matters to Bolingbroke that in this symbolic room, this heart of political London, that Richard II had built as the great symbol of his power, that's where he should kind of be most humbled, I suppose. And to look at the deposition scene in more detail, Bolingbroke says, "Fetch hither, Richard, that in common view he may surrender, so we shall proceed without suspicion." And you've got the image there of the historical King Henry IV with a wonderful headdress on. So this passage where Bolingbroke summons Richard to Whitehall has got an interesting pun in it. You see, that in common view. He's referring here to the fact that he wants the deposition to take place in the House of Commons. So there's a pun on commons and common there. Thus kind of sanctioning, I suppose, his status as the new monarch. It's going to happen in front of the Parliament. Gives him kind of more authority, I suppose, to be on the crown. The scene that follows could itself be termed a kind of pun, and it's playing on the idea, subverting the idea of the actual coronation of a king itself. And several critics have pointed out the way that Richard's main speech in the deposition scene is kind of a reversal of the process that the monarch undergoes at his coronation. I can see a few of you smiling at the wonderful Ralph Fiennes picture, which I couldn't resist, partly being a Ralph Fiennes fan, but mainly because the site on which I found this picture described this as Ralph Fiennes employing all the charisma at his disposal to play Richard II, which I just loved. He looked so gormless. Anyway, that's Richard unwilling to give up the crown in the deposition scene. So I'm going to read the speech and we're going to look at it in detail. "Now mark how I will undo myself. I give this heavy weight from off my head and this unwieldy sceptre from my hand, the pride of kingly sway from out my heart. With mine own tears I wash away my balm. With mine own hands I give away my crown. With mine own tongue deny my sacred state. With mine own breath release all duteous oaths. All pomp and majesty I do forswear. My manners, rents, revenues I forego. My acts, decrees and statutes I deny. God pardon all oaths that are broke to me. God keep all vows unbroke that are made to thee. Make me that nothing have, with nothing grieved, and thou with all pleased that hast all achieved. Long mayst thou live in Richard's seat to sit, and soon lie Richard in an earthly pit. God save King Henry, unkinged Richard says, and send him many years of sunshine days." So the last 8 lines here, reading up from the bottom, from God pardon all oaths that are broke to me, as you'll have noticed, are in rhymed couplets, and they're perfectly balanced antitheses. We have a description in each of the alternating lines of what will happen to Richard and what will happen to Henry. We've got this, as I say, kind of perfect balance between the two. Many critics, I should say, have read the whole play as being balanced in this way, and they see its structure as kind of a cross. It's about Henry's ascent and Richard's descent at the same time. So arguably the way these lines are structured to reflect the contrast between what's happening to the two different men mirrors the whole structure of the play itself. From the opening line, "Mark how I will undo myself," the main body of this speech is concerned with the question of how far Richard himself is defined by kingship. Does he have an identity outside of being a king? That's the question it's really asking us, I suppose. What does it mean to be in that phrase he used at the end, unkinged Richard, I suppose? He's no longer Richard II, he's just Richard now. What does that mean? In what I've already described as a kind of reversal of the coronation process, we see how Richard hands back the sceptre and hands back the crown. And I've just put two remarkably similar images here of Richard II in his coronation robes and Elizabeth I in hers. And they're both holding the sceptre. It's kind of like a funny ball with a stick coming out of it. I don't know how else to describe it, really. They're holding the royal sceptre, and they're both wearing their crowns here. Richard, in the speech, gives back these two great symbols of what it means to be a king. Richard's language here also replicates some of the kind of ceremonial formality of the coronation itself, especially those repeated lines, "With mine own tears I wash away my balm, with mine own hands, with mine own tongue, with mine own breath." He's employing here what's known as the rhetorical device of Anaphora. I don't know if you've heard this word. It's spelled Anaphora, Anaphora. And Anaphora is when you make a speech where every line begins in the same way, and it's a particularly kind of formal way of speaking, I suppose. So he's using this kind of repeated structure to his words in order to kind of recreate some of the ceremonial function of the coronation with its very formal language. Notice also there's a really important phrase here when he talks about his sacred state. And in the next section of the lecture, the last main section, I'm going to be talking about the way that both Richard, the historical Richard, and Shakespeare lived in an age when it was believed that the monarch was sacred. It was thought that the monarch ruled by kind of a divine right, that there was a direct correspondence between God ruling from heaven and the monarch ruling in England. And today, obviously, the Queen is still the head of the Church of England, but we've kind of lost this sense of the kind of divine role of the King or Queen, which is really important to the play. Perhaps the single most important part of the coronation ceremony is the moment when the new monarch is anointed with the holy water. This is the balm that Richard is referring to here. And this symbolises the kind of investment in the new king or queen of this divine power. And it's this belief in the sacred state of the monarch, sacred state is Richard's phrase, that makes the idea of deposing a crowned king so traumatic in this period, because you're not only going against sort of history, I suppose, but you're going against the will of God, they would have believed. So we should also note that Richard, in the speech here, doesn't seem to believe that he's going to die instantly when he gives up this power, when he's no longer the divinely anointed king. He will be left with mine own tongue. He'll be left with a voice. There'll be something of him left that he can use to deny his sacred state. He has some kind of life the speech seems to suggest, in answer to the question I posed at the beginning, he has some kind of life outside of his role purely as a monarch, some kind of physical life or other kind of presence. And I'm going to develop this idea in the remainder of the lecture, the contrast between a king or queen's physical or actual body and their kind of political, divinely anointed body. And I'll explain a little bit about the relationship between the two in the period. Before I go into that into detail, though, I want to point out the way that the speech we've just looked at, the deposition speech, kind of builds upon and develops some important ideas from Richard's earlier speech, in which he's first registering the desperate nature of the position he's in, and he's beginning to kind of express his despair at the fact he knows he's going to lose the crown. He has this amazingly frank, despairing speech, and then pulls himself together and kind of says, oh no, of course that can't be, and carries on for a bit longer. But this is really the moment at which he realizes, quite rightly, that the game is up. And I'm wondering if somebody would like to read. Michelle, do you want to? I'm sorry it's so long. Do you want to read it for us? One column and then the other. Thank you.
Let's talk of graves, of worms and epitaphs, make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executions and talk of wills, and yet not so, for what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies to the ground? Out lands, out lives, and all our Bolingbrookes, and nothing can we call our own but death, and that small model of the buried earth, which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground, and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king, keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene, to monarchize, be feared and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable, and humored thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell king. Cover your heads, and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty, for you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread, like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me that I am a king?
Thank you, that's brilliant. This is a lesson in not using the spell check, but in proofreading. Outlands our lives, our lands our lives. I'm sorry, but you read very well. It wasn't your fault, it was mine. Okay, so there's a lot to say about this speech, and we'll probably look at it in more detail in seminar on Friday, but I want to just point out a few things here. To begin with the last lines, you'll see how the underlying idea here, the question of what identity Richard might have outside of being a king, it's the same question that's the focus of that speech in the deposition scene. We get another pun on subjected. Subjected thus, how can you say that I am a king? Richard's at once making himself the subject of the speech, but he's also putting himself in the position of an ordinary subject or citizen. Okay, he's taking himself down from the throne and imagining what it means to be a subject rather than a king. The central conceit of the speech is based upon contemplating the crown, and most productions have Richard holding and looking at the crown while he's making the speech. And he notices in the speech not just how much power the crown symbolizes, but also the fact that it's literally hollow, okay, that there are limits to the power conferred upon the king, I suppose. It's a really cynical and kind of unsettling discovery for Richard. Is possessing the crown really worth anything when it's empty, when it's just a symbol? Okay, at this point, Bolingbroke has all the power. As he says, our lands, our lives, and all are Bolingbroke's. All Richard has is this symbol, the crown itself, and it starts to look remarkably hollow and meaningless for him. We also find in this speech a variation on Jaquis's All the World's a Stage speech that we looked at in the very first week of the course. The circle of the crown becomes, as Richard gets kind of more and more distraught in what he's imagining here, it becomes a court in which there's a macabre little play going on. Death is figured here as a jester. That word antic sits there, the antic, at the top of that second column, means jester. And Death is kind of acting out a little play in the hollow of the crown, cynically mocking or taunting Richard, I suppose, playing out a kind of cruel mockery of what kingship looks like. And this bit of the speech, the bit on the top right there, is particularly interested in the false assumption that kings are in some way immortal. Those lines, as if the flesh which walls about our life were brass, impregnable. They're really important lines. In actual fact, Richard's revealing this to be an illusion, okay? The king is not immortal. His skin is not impregnable. We don't get that kind of really acute image. The illusion is very easily shattered. The pinprick can actually pierce the skin, can damage the monarch, can kill the king. So, like Richard's speech at the deposition, which we looked at a few minutes ago, Shakespeare's here exploring the question of where the king's own personal body, his physical existence, stops, and where his divinely ordained power as the monarch starts. One of the most important revelations as a result of this is the fact that kings die. And this is one of the things that Richard dwells on a bit in the speech here. In one of the speech's more simple but kind of revealing moments, he gives this kind of catalogue of how different kings have died, some of them more gruesome than others. And in doing this, he's kind of being forced to confront his own mortality. And yet there's also something else in Richard's language at the same time. He's still employing the royal we, our lands, our lives. And in a crucial line, he refers to himself in the plural. He says, "For what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies?" He doesn't say body singular, he says body plural. And this is an allusion to a really important idea in the period in which Shakespeare, and indeed Richard II, lived. And this is known as the idea of the king's two bodies. Richard's alluding directly to this here. According to this theory of what it means to be a king, kings have both their ordinary kind of physical body, but also a spiritual or divine body in which their royal power is housed. And we might think of this kind of other body in terms of the body politic. That's a really popular metaphor, the idea that the people of a nation make up a body of which the king is a head. So there's kind of a symbolic or spiritual body of the king and also a physical one as well. And Richard is going to lose both of these bodies to Bolingbroke in one way or another. It's the idea of this kind of sacred function of the monarch as the head of the body politic that allows for the famous proclamation, "The king is dead, long live the king." Okay, the idea that whilst one king's physical body might have been exhausted, the divine or spiritual body of the king is still alive because it's just passed on instantly to his successor. Okay, Richard II, it's worth pointing out, is notable in that it shows a monarch losing his divine or sacred body whilst his physical body is still alive. Usually you lose both at the same point, but Richard's in this kind of state of suspended animation where he gives over the sacred function, the body politic. He loses control of that to Bolingbroke, but his physical body continues to exist. This medieval theory of the king's two bodies was very well known in Shakespeare's day. It was explained in this famous legal book called Plowden's Reports, which was published in the 1570s. And its importance to Shakespeare has been explained to us in a very important book in 1957, which is still important. This is Ernst Kantorowicz's The King's Two Bodies. He has a whole chapter on Richard II in there where he explains the importance of this idea. Elizabeth I's coronation on the 15th of January of 1559 was a particularly grand affair. and I'm going to explain why this is important to the theory of the two bodies as we go along. Here you can see an image of her being taken on a very elaborate boat to be crowned. You can see just about make out all of her finery in the middle. She was taken through London, stopping at 5 different locations, and at each different location there was a pageant put on, kind of celebrating her new power. In Elizabeth's times, as in Richard II's times, it was considered particularly important that the monarch be made visible to the people, so that people could see the physical body of the monarch that manifested this divine body, this divine right to rule. So this relationship between the two was very pronounced, I suppose, was very explicit. The physical or actual body of the queen or king would be dressed particularly elaborately for the coronation. And this is in order to reflect the spiritual role, the importance of being head of the body politic. Richard II and Elizabeth I were both accused of being particularly into fashion and loving clothes, and their coronation outfits, as we've already seen, were particularly elaborate. This is another image from the RSC Histories. And at one point in the play, the Duke of York criticises Richard for being unwilling to listen to advice unless it's about the latest fashions from Italy. I won't read that bit out, but you can have a look at it. So before television or newspapers or internet, displaying the monarch, making the monarch visible, showing this kind of manifestation of the divine right to rule in physical form, meant actually taking the monarch out into the streets, taking them on procession or progress. And every summer Elizabeth I would embark on a great progress to kind of be shown off to her people. They didn't often get very far, I should say, because, well, it's pretty obvious when you see how they're all dressed. It took them quite a long time to travel any great distance with this get-up. But she would be taken out and shown off to the people that she was ruling over. All of this, I should say to you, is also going to be relevant the week after next when you go to the Globe and you think about vision in Shakespeare's London. You're thinking about the role of sight and spectacle. So bear in mind this importance of showing off the monarch's physical body when you go to the Globe in 2 weeks' time. The historian Patrick Collinson has emphasised the way in which these processions really impressed citizens and gave them a sense of being connected to the monarch, of having witnessed this divine power. And this is explained for you here. Collinson says, Elizabeth in procession may well have been a familiar sight in and around London as she moved from one palace to another, by road or river, and displayed herself ceremonially when she returned to Whitehall to keep Christmas. There were set-piece encounters with poor subjects, especially on Maundy Thursday, when she washed the feet of as many poor women as the years of her age, and distributed clothing, loaves and fishes, claret and purses containing the same number of silver pennies. I'm sure they're all very grateful for the claret. We get this real sense here of the way in which the monarch is connected to the people. They are part of the body politic. She's interested in making sure, or at least appearing to make sure, that they have the food and drink that they need. She goes out into the community and makes herself visible. And this is all part, as I say, of this interconnected body politic. And it's this phenomenon of showing the monarch to the people that Shakespeare plays upon at the end of Richard II. In which we get another cruel reversal of the coronation process as undertaken by Elizabeth I. In a kind of parody of what happens at the coronation, Richard is paraded from that deposition scene in Westminster Hall to the Tower of London. Usually, as we heard last week, the monarch would spend the night before their coronation in the Tower and then be taken to Westminster Hall to be crowned. So you've got a reversal of what usually happens at the coronation. In another juxtaposition of the kind of downfall of Richard with the rise of Henry, this mockery of a coronation process takes place just after Bolingbroke has started to plan his own coronation. He says, on Wednesday next, we solemnly set down our coronation. Here, in contrast, we've got Richard being taken to the Tower. And I put up a quote there of the Queen, Isabel, describing the journey to Julius Caesar's ill-erected tower that Richard will undergo. So as one monarch is kind of coming to the end of his reign, we get a sense that another is taking his place. And so the cycle that persists throughout Shakespeare's history plays repeats itself again. The king is dead, long live the king. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I will see you all on Friday. Just to say a word about preparation for Friday's seminar. Obviously, you have Richard II to read in the Norton edition, the essay by Paul Hammer in the course pack, which I've talked about quite a bit today. And then, as you'll know, there are, I think, 4 or 5 of you who are doing particular research on Whitehall. I don't know, do you want to wave at me if you're doing Whitehall as your research? 1, 2... Brilliant. These wonderful volunteers are going to post on Blackboard by 6 o'clock on Thursday what they've found out. So the rest of you, make sure you log on and have a look at their findings, because we'll use them in seminar. Okay, I'll see you all then.